Welcome to this talk from the University of Lincoln School of Social and Political Sciences. I say talk, it's like a showcase event. Thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. The idea of this is to tell you a little bit about the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Lincoln, and to give you a sense of what we do. And my excellent colleagues, Dr. Lauren Hall and Professor Steve McKay, will talk a little bit about their research. My name is Edwin Bacon. I'm head of school here. I don't intend to say too much. I'm really just chairing the event, and hopefully you'll get a sense of how we work, what we work on. We'll give you an opportunity to chat with us either in the chat or possibly by unmuting later on as we get there. Just very briefly, these are the subjects that we teach in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Lincoln. Criminology, politics and international relations, social policy, and sociology. So if you're on this call, if you've taken the time out to join us this evening, then the presumption is that you're interested in at least one of these. I insist on adding at the bottom that we have joint degrees across these various subjects. It may well be that you're not sure exactly what you want to do now. It may well be that even when you get to applying, you think, I quite fancy a bit of one and a bit of the other. Have a look at our joint degrees. And I would also add that whichever of these particular subjects you may choose, we work very much as a school that teaches across our subjects. So of course you'll have the core elements of these different subjects, but you'll be able to study options across all of them. And then I just put the link up there to our school website. And the last slide I want to show you is just to give you a sense of the people who teach in the school. And one of the differences, I guess one of the things, sorry, my phone is, sorry about that. One of the things that may be different once you get to university in terms of the approach and the teaching that you might get, and that is that people who work in the school, they're excellent teachers, but they also engage in research, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight, to hear about the research of Steve and of Lauren. And I put together this slide here that just has some book covers of the various books that many members of the school have written. I could have chosen many more, but just to give you a sense that people in the school, they don't just study the subjects and teach it, but they research at the cutting edge of them and write the books from which we may teach. Okay, so that's by way of brief introduction. I hope you're getting a sense of who we are and what we do. I'm going to hand over now in turn to my colleagues to give a little talk around their particular areas of research. We'll start with Professor Steve McKay, and then we'll go over, when Steve's finished, to Dr. Lauren Hall. Steve, can I hand over to you at this point? Are you all set and ready to go?
Yeah, I'm unmuted, and hopefully I'll be able to share some files now. So, yeah, so good evening, welcome. I'm Steve McKay. As already said, I'm a professor at University of Lincoln. Before I was at Lincoln, I was a professor at University of Birmingham. Before that, worked at Bristol, and I've been at Lincoln for more than 7 years, 7.5 years, and counting. And as I had a school has already said, one of the features of Lincoln is we combine an interest in teaching with an interest in doing research on a wide range of topics. My normal research idea is about poverty and inequality. I also do a fair bit of work in politics these days, looking at MPs' careers. For now, just to talk a bit about what I've been doing, looking at families during the pandemic, and particularly during the lockdown phase of the pandemic earlier this year. Edwin's already put up a few publications. I'll quickly put up a couple of mine. So earlier in this year, I did this report for the London School of Economics, which was about whether the pandemic affected relationships between children and non-resident parents. So that was a study about what happened in families where the parents had separated, what was then happening to the children As you may remember at the time, there were concerns about whether children who were in more than one household, whether they should continue to move between households, between mum and dad typically, or whether that would change in any way, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then more recently, I did this study with the Marriage Foundation, parents in lockdown, and that was about families who were together rather than separated. So we're looking there at parents, how they were coping with the lockdown, how it affected their relationships, whether their relationships were getting better or worse. And that was partly prompted by a few media sort of scare stories saying there's going to be this big rise in divorce. The lockdown is over because all these people will be at each other's throats, that kind of thing. But we wanted to look at a more kind of factual basis for that to see whether that was borne out by the facts or not. And for those of us think about coming to Lincoln, there's quite a few of us do work around families, around parenthood, around masculinity, about how fathers and mothers look after their kids, how it affects our identities. This is very much, I'm now talking from the more from the sociology, social policy end of things. Although there are kind of criminological aspects here as well, but mostly I'll be talking sociology and social policy. And as you will see here, that story of the Marriage Foundation was actually covered in the press. So if you saw Sunday Times, Express, Mail recently talking about a lack of divorce boom, that basically originates with this story. I suppose the other thing I'd say about people at the University of Lincoln, like myself, is we don't just do academic work for academic work's sake. We often are engaged with people setting policy or lobbying for policy. I did this quite short project with the Marriage Foundation. I mean, as the name suggests, they're mostly interested in marriage, but I was interested in looking at what happened to relationships as a whole, whether married or not. So we just happened to team up for this particular piece of work. Now, if you think about the pandemic, I must admit, at the beginning of the pandemic, the lockdown around March, April, as a researcher, you've got kind of two choices. Do you just hope this thing just goes away and you're more interested in, you want your research to go back to normal and just see this as a kind of odd phase, or whether you should turn your attention to actually studying the pandemic as something important in and of itself. As for the beginning of the pandemic, I was mostly hoping it would get out of the way and I'll go back to my normal research. But as it got a bit longer, and people were talking more about how it would affect families, then I thought, well, maybe this is actually worth studying in its own right, rather than just hoping it was gone, but actually say, well, this is a opportunity to look at what happens to families when something like this happens to them. And if you think about how it would affect families, and particularly families with children, you can think there might be a number of negative effects, but also a number of potentially positive effects. On the negative effects side, you would see people with reduced incomes because people were either losing jobs or maybe on furlough and getting 80% or so of their earnings. Different schemes for self-employed. That would generally be a negative for families. Secondly, there's greater uncertainty about the future, and uncertainty is normally quite stressful. Also, ways in which families were affected. So often you might have, the sort of mother doing a frontline caring role would continue to work, but the father might have an office-based job, which then is transferred to home, and that might change their roles in the family quite a lot. Certainly, I know couples where one's on furlough, one isn't, and that creates all kinds of changes to their relationships. But obviously, those working directly in the front line, working for the NHS, which is 1 million people, or in social care, there's just lots more workplace stress from their situations. But then turning to the positive side, I mean, a lot of people would have gained time, which normally would have spent commuting. So people might find more time to spend with their families, particularly their children, rather than being out of the house most of the time. They might spend more time with their family, which could be positive. For many people, working at home might be a positive benefit rather than a negative, though of course that will vary a lot. So you can sort of make an argument that says things would be worse in many ways, but you can also make an argument that some aspects were more positive. And as ever, when you've got this kind of on one hand, on the other hand, you find some way to break that down. And in this case, what we wanted to do was look at some actual data to see what happened. So one thing about the pandemic is it's quite hard for us as individuals to do any collecting data, interviews, surveys, focus groups or whatever. But there are other groups who were doing field work, were doing interviews. We kind of relied on that. So in your kind of A levels, you might come across this distinction between quantitative research, qualitative research, and within the school, you'll find people doing mixtures of both. But for this, and Eleanor, no, we can't hear you or see you. We can only see your chat. The quick intervention. We do quantitative and qualitative research, and each of has their role, each has their place. This particular study was done in a quantitative way because it was about numbers. It was about how many people were worse off, how many people were better off. Where do we get the data? Well, there's a big academic study called the Understanding Society that's been running for well, decades, in fact, but most recently a 10-year survey of people since 2010. So in 2010, University of Essex selected some families, and they've been interviewed ever since. Roughly 50,000 people per year. They've been followed up over time. People leave the survey, but people have joined them. Now, what I'd say here is, again, if you do any kind of social science A levels, you'll be aware. You should be asking, where's the data from? Is it biased? Is it representative? And that's something to pick up in questions. But what I'll say more briefly is, as I say here, no source of data is going to be perfect. Yes, there's bias in some sources. And I mean, as we can talk about, opinion polls don't always give us the right answer, as you may have seen with various elections recently. But in terms of data quality, the Understanding Society Family Survey is about as good as survey evidence gets in the UK. It's got a lot of money behind it. It's done on a regular basis. We can look at who stays in, who drops out of studies, and so on. So it's not a it's not perfect source. There are no perfect sources, but it's about as good as it gets. Okay. So turning to some results. I'll say two things about results. First, the thing to say is there's lots of continuity. This sort of seismic event happening, kind of lockdown happening to many of us. For a lot of people, things didn't necessarily change all that much. So when we look at the intact families, those parents who were together, basically 70% said the relationship wasn't any better or any worse because of the lockdown. They just said it was same as it was before. Whether good or bad, it was just the same. Again, so you had about roughly 1 in 5 who said that their relationships actually were improving because they were able to spend more time together, more time with children, and so on. You had a 10% figure which said things had got worse, and in particular, people talked about the division of household chores, who was doing that, the effect of being around people you didn't necessarily always want to be around. By and large, so the biggest factor was, for most people, it wasn't a big effect. And there's roughly, for every person who said things had got worse, 2 said things had got better. Again, for the separated families, again, they were concerned about how children were moving between families. Again, for most families, that continued as before. On the other hand, despite lots of continuity, and this is my kind of final point I want to make, what does seem to be the case is the lockdown tends to make existing inequalities worse. So when you look at the kind of couples who said things were worse, they were mostly poorer, younger, and newer, and particularly among women rather than men. So those who were more likely to say things had got worse tended to be in more fragile situations, and those who said things were fine or got better tended to be older and better off and in more stable circumstances. Again, if you look at those families where children were moving between mum and dad over a regular basis, generally things carried on as they had before, but where there had been the worst relationships, that's where, if child contact was going to drop anywhere, it was where the parents basically didn't get on with each other, and during the lockdown, it's an opportunity for them to continue to not get on very well and to affect the movement of children between them. So that's just a kind of couple of examples of research I was involved in during the pandemic phase, and some of that carries on. For example, I've also been looking at what's been happening to police-reported crime during the lockdown, which, as you might expect, is mostly down, not down in all areas, and indeed with antisocial behaviour increasing. And as I said, this is a kind of small scale but quantitative piece of work, and a lot of work going on in the school, which you may be about to hear from a colleague, tends to be more qualitative in nature. But anyway, at that point, I shall cease and hand back to either to Edwin or Lauren, who wants to take up next. And if you've got any questions about any of this, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll pick it up now, or either now or at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I found that really interesting. Working with you, I don't often get a chance to sit back and listen to your research. If those on the chat have a quick question they want to throw in, even, I know it can be difficult to try and frame a question, particularly in an online chat. Feel free to put a word and a question mark, and we'll try and interpret it. But can I just ask a question, Steve? Because I've been interested for a long while just to get chat going. So opinion polls. I'm going to take your hint and ask you about opinion polls. How big is the opinion poll that you're talking about on your slides here? And the follow-on to that is, how big does an opinion poll have to be before you can start generalizing and saying, right, this is what people in the country think? I'm always amazed at the numbers that are involved in these.
Yeah, the study we're looking at here, the parents who are together, we've got about 2,700. There's 2,700 parents who are together. And then if you look at those in families where they're apart, we've got roughly about 500 parents who are separated, which is not as many as we would like. We would like a few more. Without getting into too much statistical theory, basically the larger the sample, assuming it's representative, the more confidence you can having it. And the kind of figure you tend to hear on the, which isn't entirely accurate, is if you get a sample of 1,000, and say roughly half say yes, half say no, you can be pretty sure that the answer is within 3 percentage points. So with a sample of 1,000, if half say they want Brexit, you can be pretty sure the number's between 47 and 53. The problem with these things, as you know, often it's quite important to know whether it's 47 or 53. In the run up to Brexit, it was 58-42. So a sample of 1,000 is what political opinion polls aim for, and if that 1,000 is representative, you're going to be within about 3% of the actual true population figure. But if you want to get within about 1% of the true population figure, then you need to be looking at more like 5,000, which is a lot more expensive to run. And then you're into whether you can actually make it representative and whether you get the right kind of people. And what's gone wrong with a lot of polls, and you'll hear this in the American election as well as Brexit, is when you do these kinds of studies where you're actually getting to the least engaged, those often who are the kind of white working class is the kind of issue that tends to be the group who often get missed. The white working class being those likely to vote for Trump, likely to vote for Brexit, who weren't always picked up. That's taken us further into other territory of a political kind, which I'm happy to talk about, but I mean, only if people want me to talk about it.
Yeah. I was sort of hijacking the chat there because I've got the mic, and it's a bit cheeky of me. As I say, if anybody does want to chuck a question in the chat, it doesn't have to be about opinion polls, about family policy or the work that Steve has talked about, then do feel free to do that. And anytime over the next 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, even while my colleague Dr. Lauren Hall is talking, feel free to throw questions in as you think of them, either in relation to Steve's talk just now or to Lauren's talk, which is just about to come up. It'd be great to get you engaging and have some sense of the things that these talks raise in your own minds. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Lauren Hall, who's going to talk about prison. Lauren, over to you.
Hey, perfect. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to have you here. And like Edwin said, I'm going to talk a little bit about prisons today. And the reason I've chosen prisons is because I do a bit of research in prisons, but also it's sort of a key aspect of the criminal justice system that we currently study and think about at every stage of the criminology degree. So without further ado, let's get going. So this is a lovely picture that I took of the cathedral, and this was from the campus. So I'm presuming you may have not had the chance to get around the campus yet, but there's some gorgeous views. So I thought I'd treat you all with a lovely picture that I took on my walk home one evening last year. So the aim of my talk today is to give you a little taste of what studying criminology at Lincoln is like. And before we begin, I'll give you a quick overview of what criminology and studying criminology entails, before we more specifically think about prisons. Criminology criminology, as some of you may well be aware if you're maybe already doing an A-level in criminology, asks these four questions essentially. So it encourages you to think about what crime is, and particularly at the minute in first year, we really unpack our understanding of crime and the ways in which we construct our ideas about crime and what shapes those opinions. We also ask why crime happens, so what causes crime, why do some people engage in it and why do some people not commit crime, and how do we respond to it as well, so the ways in which we punish people and the different sentences that are used, and also the ways in which we can actually encourage people to stop committing crime post punishment. So these are some of the questions we can think about broadly in connection to understanding criminology. And as you can probably imagine, there's plenty of different topics and themes I could have focused on today. But as I've said, I've chosen prison because I do some research there, but I'm not alone in that. There's other members of our school who do research in prison as well. So primarily Dr. Helen Nichols, who's our current programme leader, and she examines the roles of masculinities in prison and also learning in prison. So let's think a little bit more about prisons. No doubt prisons are already something that you have awareness of, you've got your own thoughts around, and this is one of the beautiful things I think about criminology. It encourages all to think about our own perceptions and views on certain issues. So everybody has engaged in some way with some sort of criminal justice related concept before. So in that regard, it gives people a lot more confidence to start talking and thinking about these topics. And one of the biggest influences on understandings of crime is arguably the media and also politics. And both of these things together can work really well to shape our understanding of punishment. But actually what we start to think about, particularly in first year at the minute, is whether or not we get an accurate representation of the criminal justice system and how it works. And so thinking specifically about prisons today, I'm going to think about some of the lived experiences of what it's like in prison and the kinds of people who go to prison. We'll think about some of the problems that prison faces. And then we'll think as well about life after prison. So as I've got here a few examples of the ways in which the media influence our perceptions, I've got a few headlines here. So just to read a couple out to you, because this slide isn't very clear, but Home Secretary Priti Patel, I want criminals to feel terror. And we've got this little picture down here of a Kinder egg. So mum used Kinder eggs to smuggle drugs into go in prison. So these are good examples of some of the ways in which the media engages with aspects of our criminal justice system and the ways in which we should punish people. So no doubt you'll already have some ideas forming around media articles you may have come across, or even crime documentaries you may have watched that think about the role of prison in our societies. And even this week, I've been speaking to first year students about true crime entries on Netflix. I don't know if anybody's watched anything recently, but there's a good new series out called Trial by Media on Netflix, and that thinks about the role of the media explicitly with regards to crime news and crime stories, and that's been really well. And yeah, I've recommended that to some of my students even this week. So don't disregard engagement with true crime and crime in the news. They can be really useful starting points to begin talking about some of these issues. So if I was to ask you what prison is meant to do, you might want to pop your answers into the chat about this, feel free to. But you'd probably say prison's meant to punish people. So it's meant to be an unpleasant experience for people who commit crime. It's meant to keep the public safe. So whilst someone's incarcerated, they are physically unable to harm members of the public. And it's also meant to rehabilitate people. So it's meant to sort of change maybe the way they act or think or feel in order to encourage them to stop committing crime. Actually, what we start to think about in criminology is the extent to which punishment does only focus on one person. And we argue that, in fact, it doesn't a lot of the time. So families and friends of people who are incarcerated can also be affected by that process. And often family members can also say that they feel stigma as a result of their loved one being incarcerated. So actually we begin to question whether or not punishment is just applied to one person, or if in fact it starts to affect people beyond that individual as well. With regards to keeping the public safe as well, we start to think critically about this and considering the way, or the fact that actually a lot of people are going to be released from prison. I won't spend too long on this. I'm going to think a little bit more about this in a couple of slides' time. Regarding rehabilitation as well, we also encourage you to think about, is prison the best environment to help change people for the better? And I've got just an image I found on Google here which says prison is an expensive way of making bad people worse. So this is an interesting idea to think about, and it's certainly a concept that we consider in more detail throughout the course. So we think about the strengths and the weaknesses of prison and the impact that it has. So already I hope I'm sort of starting to demonstrate the complexities of punishment in prison. So I want to talk about the lived experience of prison. So I'm going to be drawing on some of my research, but also some lived experience quotations from some books that I will recommend to you at the end of the session today, and also some of the characteristics of people who are incarcerated. So this table is from a source called the Bromley Briefings, and it's a really good source. If you're interested in prison at all, I'd recommend checking it out because it's got a lot of really accessible information. You can just Google the Bromley Briefings and it's got. And what this slide basically shows us are some of the characteristics that we know are associated with people who are incarcerated. So to pick a few out, for example, 24% of the prison population was taken into care as a child. 29% experienced abuse as a child, and 41% observed violence in the home as a child. So there's a few other descriptors on there, but what we're starting to see with regards to these characteristics is the fact that actually we've got quite a disadvantaged group of people who are incarcerated. They've had some horrible experiences previously in life, and this is important to think about with regards to the impact of prison, and particularly if we're thinking about that rehabilitation aspect. If people have experienced awful situations previously in life and then they're incarcerated in what is not arguably the best situation or circumstances to be rehabilitated in, what are their chances of changing their life for the better when they leave? So awareness of the kinds of people and the kinds of experiences that they've had who are incarcerated is also something we encourage our students to think about here at Lincoln. And you may think, well, you know, lots of people are taken into care and it doesn't mean that they all commit crime, and that's exactly true. But it does mean that the way in which we apply punishment is not necessarily always equal or experienced equally. So it's just worth bearing in mind. Here I have a quotation from one of my research participants. So this was a gentleman who lives in Blackpool now, and he experienced incarceration, drug addiction throughout his life. So in this quotation, he talks about having multiple attempts to detox from drug use and to recover. He'd had several prison sentences. But what he talks about here is one particular instance when he was in Strangeways prison in Manchester, and he was looking around at all of the older guys in there. He was mid-25, and he thought, what, this actually isn't where I want to be. I don't want my life to be like that. And he managed to move away from a life of crime once he was released. And he also managed to enter into recovery as well. So he talks at the end of the quotation about being able to get into rehab. And this last this last sentence I think is really illuminating. So he speaks about the idea that in rehab he was told, drugs aren't the problem, it was me. So he actually used that time in prison to be a really transformative experience. And this certainly is the case for some people. They will make the most of resources available to them in prison and turn their life around when they leave. So I wanted to include that as a more sort of balanced approach rather than just a heavy critique of prisons. Mostly, however, I've got this quotation from Carl Catamol, who has lived experience of being incarcerated himself and has written that a good book, which I've got a reference for at the end of these slides. But he argues we would not have to rehabilitate if we did not rehabilitate. So what he means by that is all of the experiences that some people go through in their lives and that ultimately lead them towards committing crime would largely be prevented if we had better systems in place from a sociological perspective, so with regards to the welfare state, for example. And Carl's got some videos that you can access through YouTube. If you Google his name, if you're interested in finding out more about him, he talks a lot about his prison experiences and argues strongly against the need for prisons as a punishment. He doesn't think that they meet any of those aims that I spoke about in one of those first slides. He thinks they're completely ineffective with regards to what they should be doing. So yeah, I'd recommend engaging with some work by Carl. I think he's a really interesting author and he speaks really coherently about these issues. So I'd recommend engaging with some of his work. So we've thought a little bit about what prison should do and maybe doesn't do. We've thought a little bit about how people experience prison, whether they can use it to turn their life around or whether in fact it makes people's life worse. But whilst people are in prison, there are also a number of problems they can face whilst incarcerated. And I have a couple of research strands. So I focus on ex-offenders and desistance process, which means the process whereby people leave crime behind. But I also focus on recovery from addiction. And so I often bring those spheres together and explore them together. So I thought let's briefly consider the role of drugs in prison and the impact that they have. So often people argue, of course, that drugs are really dangerous and they can be really harmful, and they therefore warrant incarceration as a response. People should be put in prison for using illegal drugs. But conversely, some people do actually argue that drug addiction often stems from trauma, and there's plenty of research which connects these two themes. And that actually putting in people in prison who have drug problems can make them worse. And I've got some information in the middle of the slide here around ways in which drugs enter prisons. So, for example, in dead pigeons thrown over prison walls, and even more recently through the use of drones. So drones can drop drugs into prisons. The point I'm trying to make here is that we send people to prison for using drugs or for being addicted to certain substances, and actually whilst they're incarcerated, they often still have access to these substances. And I have a friend at Public Health England who's just co-authored a report on substance use in prisons. Very recent, you'd be able to Google it. It's a case study of 5 male English prisons and substance use within them. And the authors describe the current drugs in prison station as an epidemic. It increases rates of violence. It damages staff and prisoner relationships. So they have a huge impact on the prison experience. And not only do some people enter prison with addiction problems, actually some people develop addiction problems whilst in prison due to the access they have to these substances. So it's a huge problem. And again, something that we encourage our students to think about, particularly in third year. So it's also important to acknowledge, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, about the need for prison to rehabilitate people, but it not necessarily being the best place to rehabilitate people. We know that actually people who are recovering from addiction need the same things as they do to stop committing crime. Actually, what we find incarceration does is make it really difficult for them to access these things. So, for example, jobs or houses. Having a criminal record can really impact people's ability to buy a house or to even rent accommodation. So there's almost a double layer of stigmatization that people experience who have faced addiction problems and been incarcerated. So these are some of the issues that we can focus in on in really critically examining that prison experience and what it's like for people. But what about life after? So this is one of my my most prioritized areas of study. I really enjoy thinking about and researching desistance from crime, which is the process, as I mentioned, where people leave that criminal lifestyle behind. Why is it important? You know, if someone's been sent to prison, surely they deserve it, surely they've done awful. Why don't we just forget about them? Well, I've got this stat here. So over 13,000 people were released from prison between April and June this year. So it's a common perception that the media promotes that actually if we send someone to prison, we can forget about them, they've been punished, it doesn't matter. But what I hope this figure demonstrates is actually that people are released from prison all the time. So we've got ex-prisoners coming back into communities and resettling in our society. And this is actually why I'd argue that it's really important that we help people to stop reoffending. And it's important that we examine and research what people need to be able to do that. Of course, adding that critical lens in there, when we think as well about the extent that prison promotes or restricts access, what they need to leave crime behind, as I'm hopefully sort of already suggesting to you guys, actually prison can limit the access to the things that they need to desist and to stop reoffending. Penultimate slide now, sorry, and whistle stop tour, but this speaks to some of my research aims to better understand how to support people to leave crime behind. So we focus on accommodation, employment and relationships. That positive relationships particularly is a key research interest of mine, but each of these factors has been identified by research as fundamental to helping someone stop reoffending. We also know that the people that they hang around with, the role of their family, and the activities they engage in as well can be really important in helping people stop reoffending, and so can a positive identity. So tying all of these things together, myself and Professor David Best, who's currently at the University of Derby, we designed and implemented a prison resettlement programme. So KFC isn't something that people need to leave crime behind. It's the name of our resettlement programme, which was the Kirkham Family Connectors programme. And basically what we did was bring the prisoners' families into the prison, and we supported them in rebuilding their relationships and also identifying activities and groups that the prisoners would engage in once they left. And it was pretty successful, so even the staff enjoyed taking part, and initially they were pretty reluctant. They had really busy work lives and heavy caseloads. They weren't very interested in a resettlement programme, but by the end they'd really enjoyed it. We made sure that the prisoners and their families had time to have a visit afterwards, and that's really important because of what the research says around the importance of family ties to desistance from crime. And yeah, we also were actually successful in connecting people in prison to volunteering opportunities, five-side football, religious groups, and even a full-time job once they'd left. So their chances, from what the research would tell us, of successfully resettling and not committing crime again would have been enhanced by this programme. So as promised, that's the book recommendation that I mentioned earlier by Carl Catamol. So if you are interested in finding a little bit more out about prison, this one's a really accessible one, and it's a survival guide to prison. So you don't have to be going to prison to read it. It just sort of tells you a little bit more about the process and what that's like. Yeah, if you do want to find out more, I'd recommend that one. That's it from me for now. I think there's been some questions and some input into the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lauren. that was great. Really enjoyed that. So myself and Steve McKay and Lauren Hall are on the chat now, and I think we changed the settings. So if any one of you who are listening in wants to open your mic and ask questions, you're able to, or you can ask questions on the chat. But we've basically got about a quarter of an hour now to ask and chat together to get a sense of what we teach, how the courses are structured, also any questions that arise from the talks that we've had. So do feel free to jump into the chat. Do feel free to, well, I guess the best way would be to put the hands up thing and then talk. But if you just want to talk, there's a good number in here, so that I don't think we're going to talk over one another too much. And yeah, I'm tempted again to ask Lauren a question, but just to get it going. Lauren, can I ask you a question? Go on. Well, just while other people are thinking.
Go for it.
So while I'm asking Lauren this question that's been bugging me, do please put something in the chat. We'd be interested to know what aspects you're interested in. I know Eleanor's put a few questions in the chat. Thanks for that. Why are you particularly interested in the subjects you are? But Lauren, I'm interested in Kinder eggs and pigeons. Maybe it says more about me that's what jumps out from your talk. But to be serious for a second, so I know it's a good thing to put in a talk to say drugs have been smuggled in Kinder eggs and in dead pigeons and via drones. But at the same time, you said, "Wow, it's a massive problem." Surely those things are so obscure. Why is how do drugs get into prison? Am I just being naive here? How is it a massive problem if we just tend to notice these rather obscure ways of getting them in?
I mean, a common method recently was the lacing of papers and letters with drugs. So particularly sort of novel psychoactive substances. People were sort of lacing paperwork, children's drawings, letters, and they were making their way into prison that way. But yeah, it's varied. It shouldn't be a problem, of course. So there is sometimes political resistance to acknowledging the extent of the problem of substance use in prisons, which is why the new report by my friend Kieran at Public Health England is but yeah, there's an array of mechanisms of getting drugs into prison, and unfortunately they're quite successful.
Yeah, I wasn't asking for advice, but yes, thank you there, Lauren. Anybody else want to unmute, ask any specific questions either on Lauren's talk or on Steve's talk earlier about families at this time? I'm just writing a question in the chat to get people talking, but if anybody else has anything they want to add in, what I'm going to put in the chat, I'm interested in how many of you engage, like politically engaged, maybe with issues around the things we're talking about. So are you a member of a political party? Are you a member of some sort of campaign group? Sorry, I'm trying to talk and chat at the same time. Have you ever signed a petition? These sorts of things. How do you engage with politics? Forgive any mistakes in there, but so you guys who are listening in, give us your answers on there, or respond to Paula's question about if there's anything in particular you're interested in that you'd like us to say more about in relation to the programs.
I should just apologise. It was me who hijacked the screen. Having seen Lauren's photography, I thought I should put up a couple of my own. by all means change it to something else.
No, I like that.
That's actually the view from Bridge House.
I was wondering if it was. It did look familiar.
If you look at where we're all based, you can just about see the cathedral from one direction. On the other side, that's actually new student accommodation at the back of that, and other university buildings. But I know we're talking about our subjects here, but you also need to think about the kind of place that Lincoln is. I don't know how many of you know Lincoln. It's an ancient city going back, to the Romans, but in the cathedral sense, 1,000 years. But it's also a centre that's really changed a lot, a city that's really changed in the last couple of decades, with a lot of modernisation, building cinemas and restaurants near the university. Now, obviously, at the moment during the lockdown, that isn't much good to you. Again, when you're thinking about choice of university, then yes, the course is really important, but you need to think about the kind of place you're going to as well. And Lincoln really is a good combination of old and new. But obviously, you need to think about what's going to suit you personally best in your what kind of place you want to live for 3 years.
So we've got a conversation going in the chat about engaging with petitions and things. People on these chats are often, I think, quite rightly to a degree, sort of slightly reluctant to get their politics out there too much. Don't feel that you necessarily have to be, but I'm interested in what are the issues? What's the most recent petition anybody signed? What's the most recent issue that's grabbed you in terms of politics or anything we've just talked about? I'm intrigued as well that nobody's fessed up to being engaged in party politics. I can't see in A levels. Cheers, Paris.
Well, Wales kind of has, isn't it? Wales and council that's banned in it.
Yeah. And I particularly enjoy Paris. The many of my friends have. Yeah. I know somebody who has. So that's a nice bit of distance in there. Anything else that people have signed on recently? It tends to be that so much is, like, as Steve was saying in his talk, so much is pandemic related at the moment.
Yeah, Amy makes a point about watching the news every day, and I think it's good to keep an eye on the news every day, but probably not to immerse yourself in the rolling coverage. I mean, I think I watched some of the American coverage. Basically, nothing happened for 2 days, but they were still broadcasting 24/7, even though essentially nothing had changed. And again, if those are in US politics, we do have a US academic, the guy who used to be a speechwriter from Arizona, and he's been doing a lot of Twitter coverage of the US election and the post-election phase. Mike Slavin, Dr. Mike Slavin's used to be directly involved in politics in Arizona, which obviously is one of those states that changed from one party to the other this time around. So if you're thinking about the other thing about the schools, we're quite big, 35, 40 academics. Will be hopefully a few more joining us in criminology in the near future, as we've got job adverts open. But it means you've got a kind of a mix from the old end, dare I say, like me, the young end, dare I say, like Lauren, with everyone else represented in between, and a mix on all different subjects. So it does give you the chance to, if you're not, I mean, you can do joint honours, absolutely you can do. If you're not sure whether to do criminology or sociology, you can do joint. But if you choose to do one or the other, you still get access to the same people, and you still get access to the kind of subjects they teach. And lots of most prisoners here don't get to vote, and also the UK is very unusual internationally that if you get a retirement pension, if you go to prison, you lose that as well, even though you've contributed towards it your entire life. If you go to prison, you lose your state pension, even though most countries of the world it continues to be paid. Here we're kind of a bit more negative. It's all kind of different. I mean, and again, my partner used to work in prisons. cause interruption to your job, your incomes, and so on. So it's seen as a kind of, remand phase is obviously partly about safety, but if you can be innocent, and that can lead to huge disruption of your life, and getting back out into jobs and suitable accommodation can be difficult. And Edwin's question with becoming an MP is not entirely academic, since 2 of our former staff went on to become MPs. So not staff, students. 2 of our former students are now MPs.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I was asking that, Steve, is this one of the questions I ask students in the second year. So I teach in the second year. If you come and study with us, you can do a course that is called Applied Politics. And one of the first things I talk to about politics students is, how many of you want to be an MP? There's a question I've just put on there, because if you're interested in doing a politics degree, I would bet a substantial amount of money that when you start it, friends and family will say, so you want to be an MP then? And one of the things we look at on the course I teach is all the different ways in which you can engage politically. It ain't just about becoming an MP, but as Steve says, if you want to be, yeah, we have a track record. We're not going to tell you who they are in case the track record is not something you approve of, but yeah.
And on another fun fact, Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, used to be a professor of social work. So he went from being an academic to, I won't say running Wales, but certainly First Minister of Wales.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Anybody else going to fess up to what they're studying at the moment and how it relates? We do, of course, I say of course, why would you know this unless you've trolled around our website? We do at Lincoln, we run a course called Parliamentary Studies, which is, I particularly emphasize it because it's not just that we study Parliament. You can do that at many universities, but there are a limited number of universities who are franchised to work with Parliament on running a Parliamentary Studies course. We had to apply for it. Not everyone who applied to run this course was able to do it. And it involves working with Parliament and people from Parliament coming in normal times, coming to Lincoln and teaching some of the course, and it involves trips to Parliament. So it's very much taught with members of staff in particular, and also some members of Parliament. So if you're really interested in Parliament, I would say this, but actually we are one of the few universities that is able to run this course with Parliament. Yeah, that's a good point, Lauren. I'm fascinated by A-level combinations, government politics, history, and textiles.
There's some great combinations in the chat.
So we're drawing towards an end. Anybody got any particular questions? And nobody has yet unmuted, but feel free to if you'd like. Has anybody got any particular specific questions about the programs? Yeah, it's a very basic question. Can I have a go at that, colleagues? Why this uni over others for these subjects? Well, there's 2 things I'd say in relation to that, Eleanor. Firstly, is that I'm always reluctant to talk at these events as if we're selling a product and you've got to compare it with other products, because as Steve said earlier, there's all sorts of things you look at when you look at a university, and I'm not here to say we're great and everything else is rubbish. There's lots of good universities that do lots of different things, but what I would say is distinct about Lincoln, which is what you're getting at. 2 things. Firstly, in the school, the breadth of the subjects that we teach, and so there's nearly 40 members of staff teaching across criminology, sociology, social policy, and politics. And if you choose one of those, say you come and choose criminology, you will do the core of criminology, but you'll be able to choose options from all of the others. And ditto if you choose politics, you'll get what you should get from a politics degree, but you'll be able to choose options across the others, should you so wish. And the other thing I'd say is what I just talked about earlier, what I call the applied aspect. In all of our programs, we have an emphasis on the difference that what you're studying might make beyond the university. So that means, in big terms, how you might change the world, but also in terms of what you might do in terms of careers and things. We have modules on how you apply politics. We have a criminology in the professions module, and I hope you picked up from Steve and Lauren's talks that we do engage very much with the outside world. It's not just about academic thinking. We very much engage with the policy world. Hope that answered it, Eleanor.
I'm just looking at your question there, Paris, as well. I think there is an option for a study abroad year. Is that right, Edwin? I think Claire is there.
Yes, no, there is. If you want to go abroad, yes, there's a study abroad year, which would fit after your second year. So you'd end up doing 4 years. You do the first 2 years study abroad. We have bespoke partnerships with I think about a dozen universities now across Europe and in America, one in Japan, one in Africa, and the numbers are growing all the time. So you definitely do have that option, yes.
I've also got some good connections with local services who are always looking for volunteers. So Double Impact Recovery Academy is based in Lincoln, and they've shown interest in our students volunteering with them before, and that's a service that promotes recovery from addiction. And I've also just developed a connection with Care After Combat in Newark, and they work with people who have past military experience who've been incarcerated, and they provide mentors, voluntary mentors, to support people to get used to life after prison again, and also with that sort of military lens. So yeah, and I'm sure there's plenty of other connections that our staff members could draw in their research fields and connect that to the
Yeah, and
course.
I've just thrown as well, we have a second year course called Social Engagement, where half of the course is getting a placement, a work opportunity somewhere, usually somewhere local, and well, it has to be somewhere local in order to carry on with the rest of your degree. And so you study what it means to work in that place, then you work there for a bit, and then you write about that at the end of it. So again, this engagement beyond, it's actually a thing not just for our school, but Lincoln has has done a lot of work promoting the idea of what we call a civic university, engaging with citizens and engaging with the city. Lincoln is a beautiful small city, and so in that sense it's quite easy to have this presence of a university and engage within that. Okay, well, I've got about a minute left. We might even have 30 seconds left, and it's 18:59 on my computer. If there are no final urgent questions, or if there are, then raise the hand. If not, can I just say thank you very much for giving up your time to be with us, listen to us this evening. I've certainly enjoyed it. I think we've got a good chat going. I'm grateful to my colleagues Lauren and Steve for presenting something of their research. As I put in the chat, feel free to email us. There's loads of information on the web anyway. And there are virtual open days organised. This has been very specifically in relation to the School of Social and Political Science and the subjects that we study. But thanks very much, and let me wish you all the best with your studies and your choices as you look forward to, as you go through applying to university, and hope to see some of you face to face in Lincoln one day. All the best. Bye bye.
Take care, everyone.